Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversations, intellectual dialogues, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's BIC Stream session is called The Reliability of News, Making Sense of the World in an Era of Post-Truth. Ever since mass media evolved in the first half of the 20th century, our sense of the public realm has been shaped by the news we receive from media institutions. We operate by the assumption that this news is reliable, factually accurate, and the editors and journalists of media institutions can be trusted to uphold high ethical standards, fully aware of the societal impact that they have. This is no longer the case. The intrusion of social media into news dissemination has blurred the very idea of a media institution as a source of news. We are bombarded with more information than we can digest, much of it misinformation. Many media institutions are more overt in their biases, and society is getting increasingly polarized into rigid ideological divisions. Our current era is being termed as post-truth, and the question of how we can cohere into a democratic public realm has become highly problematic. What divides news from propaganda? Is the recent increase in visibility of propaganda and fake news a deliberate project, or does it ensue from how media has evolved? Today's discussion with Arvind Rajagopal, professor of New York University, senior journalist and writer Bhasha Singh, professor of law at Ambedkar University, Lawrence Liang, moderated by writer and urban activist Alpana Kishore, will examine these questions and more and reflect on the direction we can move in to make sense of the world in a post-truth era. Full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share with the speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And speakers will address them towards the end of the session. And with that, over to Alpana.
Thank you, Lekha. And okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this session. I'm Alpana Kishore, as we have all been introduced, and I'm reintroducing everybody here. We have a truly interesting mix of experts on this panel. Two academicians, Arvind Rajagopal and Lawrence Liang, who will be bringing conceptual elements to frame this discussion, and a journalist, Bhasha Singh, who's going to bring the stark realities from the ground to complete the picture. As you all know, the topic today has been introduced by Lekha, but I'm just going to headline it again: the reliability of news, making sense of the world in an era of post-truth. The expectations from the internet, when it first burst upon us in the 90s, was that it would democratize the media. The smallest voices would have a say, they would have equal access to the stage that the big actors did, and media and information could be equally accessed by anyone with a click of a button. But it's been 25 years now, and things look very different. As you heard, media is overt in its biases. Impartiality is not considered essential or even aspirational. There is no single or absolute truth. And even fact-based truths are subjective. There is an uncontrollable polarization spread through fake news and social media. And this is what defines the post-truth era. Despite the free flow of information, I mean, it is democratic, the playing fields aren't level. That's the most important thing about this era, is that the bigger voices with the bigger resources remain the ones who control the information flow. And they remain the loudest voices. And there's hardly any representation-based or evidence-based information that has equal weightage. So in many ways, the clock is ticking backwards. At some point, there was a shift, a global shift from a liberal order set by the West to conservative and more narrow identities with strict social policing norms on the internet. The Trump era, the abortion ruling in the US, these are manifestations in the United States. Here in India, of course, we have the ultranationalism, we have a decisive shift in the perception of the state as a secular state with equality for all its citizens. How to make sense of all this as a consumer of information in the post-truth era? Who can we trust? And is there no absolute truth? What truths should we believe? If a self-policing democracy doesn't work on the internet, how can regulation work without it becoming draconian censorship? So I'm going to go through all these questions and tackle them today with our panel. We have an established format. As always, each panelist gets 10 minutes to make a presentation. This will be followed by half an hour of discussion and another half hour of questions from the audience. So let's start with Arvind Rajagopal, professor of media studies at NYU, who has written several books on his key research interests, the global history of media theory and South Asia, including Hindu nationalism. His latest book is on a global genealogy of media theory. He will be focusing on how ideology of free-flowing information promoted by the US after World War II became a sort of holy grail for the tech industry and ironically helped in the creation of fake news, because any idea of regulation became anathema to the entire architecture of social media. So Arvind, would you like to start with your presentation?
Sure. Thank you so much, Alpana, for that excellent overview of the issues. And so I have a few remarks, and obviously a lot of it will be in our Q&A, but here goes. There are many remarkable things about the latest phase of the communication revolution. For example, we are witnessing economic decline as a consequence of formal democratic procedures. For example, as in Brexit in the UK. Millions of people seem to accept stories that are questionable, to say the least. For example, that the US Democratic Party profits from child molestation, or that Donald Trump won the 2020 elections, and so on. But if we focus on fake news alone, we risk missing something even more remarkable, namely that the rich countries that used to serve as models of democracy are affected at the same time as the poorer countries that were trying to catch up with the rich. Central here is the fact that the growth of media was promoted as quickening the pace of modernization and development and as indispensable to democracy. But we are seeing liberal democracy decline and diminish, not despite, but precisely because of apparently democratic processes, such as the free flow of information and free elections, as Alpana has mentioned. The way the communication revolution is going, it may seem as if, for example, India has not only caught up with the rich countries, but has even surpassed them. We consider the disparity between the problems that ordinary citizens actually face in their lives and the issues that seem to mobilize them, for example, for elections. Politics is now conducted in a virtual arena to a great extent, although it is populated by real people earning their daily bread, going about the real world as they always have. This virtual arena seems to acquire a hold on people irrespective of the evidence of their own senses and regardless of their own interests or lack of interests in the matters involved. Issues directly affecting people can still mobilize them and bring them out onto the streets, like Agnipath, Farmers' Bill, Citizens Amendment Act. But to an increasing extent, these are the exceptions. Rather, we find problems that are removed from the daily lives of individuals. Girls wearing the hijab to school or college, plots or conspiracies that are discovered, whether Elgar Parishad, Bhima Koregaon. Little while ago, we had the Sushant Singh Rajput case. These are events that we are told affect society as a whole, offend its basic values, and thus compel all citizens to join in national condemnation and, if necessary, sanction some form of action. Now, this can remind us of the shifting tides of popular enthusiasm, like the phenomenon of the leher or wave, a term that used to characterize specific elections. One side could win a sweeping victory, riding, for example, the Garibi Hatao Leher in 1967, the Indra Hatao Leher in 1977 after the emergency, And let's recall these both predate the electronic media. The idea of the leher or wave suggests the multiple informal on-the-ground networks of information that crisscross the Indian subcontinent, and that since the colonial era, periodically was capable of taking the government unawares. Think of the mutiny, 1857. Despite the government having the bulk of the media apparatus under its control, there was a kind of people power that could break through and make itself felt. Sometimes it could even win the day. In other words, mass mobilization over symbolic issues is not new. What is new is that what used to happen at election time now happens much more often. And here we find that one or other symbolic issue aligns with government policy or government arguments. On the surface, it may appear to be that the actions of the people on the ground we are witnessing, that's what we are actually seeing. But a little investigation often suggests that what we have here is what's been called mystic democracy. It seems to be people power at work, but behind it we find an active collaboration of news media, political leaders, social media trolls. So we have to ask what it is about media that enables this kind of shift that we are witnessing. Now, as communications technology of all kinds grow, their ability to interact and create an overarching social system of communication and control also increases. This means that the way people respond to information increasingly depends on the bias or the setting of the system. This is a term from cybernetics, systems theory. We can think of the thermostat that sets the temperature and thereby also sets expectations. For example, when news of communal riots used to be reported, it was often not clear from the newspaper accounts what communities were involved, who was responsible, how many died in each community. These details were considered inflammatory and even unnecessary. We could say that the setting of the system was oriented to law and order, which had to be restored with all due speed. Now, informal systems of communication perhaps can also be said to have a bias or a setting. So a procession during a Hindu or a Muslim festival could trigger a riot if something untoward happened. But the growth of technology clearly allows this setting to have an influence that can be nationwide. Thus, for example, the Ram Mandir agitation, which was a political campaign that built on people's sentiments. It allowed the question of a temple in Ayodhya to eclipse all the urgent matters of economic liberalization. So if you look at the political debates at the time, there were no debates over economic liberalization, which was really the major issue. It was about the temple, or Mandal Masjid. Those who recall the demolition of Babri Masjid may also recall the shock and the sense of regret that large sections of the Indian public reacted with to the violence of the time. We can say that the bias or the setting of the information system at the time was towards communal harmony, relatively speaking, and against any overt endorsement of violence. And it is that setting which I think has dramatically changed today. It suggests that the setting of the thermostat that controls the temperature of communication is not what it used to be. Now, this image of the thermostat, the idea of the media as a thermodynamic system that can cool down or heat up a society as needed, these are not new images. They were devised by American communications experts in the Cold War era while they were contemplating how to respond to multiple challenges facing the United States at the end of World War II. The challenge of communism, the challenge of world leadership for the US, the challenge of the third world, what to do about colonies demanding freedom. Many arguments have been offered to try and understand this crucial historical period. One factor or one dynamic which has not, I think, received sufficient attention for very specific reasons is the category of communication and the idea of the communication revolution. And what I'd like to suggest is that the communication revolution was an idea that arose in the United States and was presented to counter the communication revolution. Yeah. And in a way, we can say today, with the hindsight of, 3/4 of a century, it was a brilliant idea. Yeah, it was a brilliant idea because it appeared to be talking about something that would certainly transform everyone's lives, right? And it was inexorable. It was coming whether you liked it or not. Yeah, so people would not have to themselves get out on the street and mobilize. They would be mobilized. Yeah, and communication was an idea that suggested community, communion, belonging, sharing, all of these meanings. In fact, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, communication and communism have the same word root, communists. Yeah, so it was a way of going above the politics of the challenge of communism with this idea of community and communication, which was utterly non-political. Yeah. And with the communication revolution, the way in which it was promoted was twofold. One, as Alpana has said, there was this idea of the free flow of information, that nothing should be allowed to impede, media, information, and images traveling wherever they wanted. Yeah. So this idea of information having its own mind. On the other hand, there was a different program and a different sales pitch for third world leaders, which was that here we give you a system to control the temperature of your societies, right? You will have your hand on the thermostat and you can adjust the mood of your population, of your citizenry, as it is convenient for you. Yeah. So there were different arguments made for different folks. And because of the way in which this field developed, the intensely political circumstances under which it evolved, this fact that the same people, the same experts, were making different arguments in different places escaped notice. And that brings us to where we are. Yeah? So I'll stop here. And thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you, Arvind, for that very comprehensive overview of issues and concepts like mystic democracy and the mass mobilization and, of course, the communication revolution that you have talked of. We will come back to that in the questioning. The next speaker who has a presentation is Bhasha Singh. And Bhasha is a consulting editor with NewsClick and a documentary filmmaker deeply involved in bringing the politics and reality of India's most marginalized sections to the mainstream media. As a senior journalist, she's been known for her work on manual scavengers or sewage workers. She's also written on farmer suicides, Dalits, and minorities. Her last book published was on the movement against the controversial CAA NRC laws. She will be talking about the media machine and how it has turned into, in her words, a perception building industry. She will also talk of the unprecedented pressures of the post-truth era on journalists and on the working practices of journalists. Bhasha, over to you.
Thanks a lot. I just want to thank Bangalore International Center for giving me this opportunity. Thanks my co-panelist Arvind and thanks Alpana. What I feel that basically what we are discussing today is a burning issue globally. And we have been witnessing this intrusion to the reality or to the kind of reporting we want from more than 3-4 decades or much before, but it has become a very prominent phenomena. And how the propaganda, the biasness is reflected in the media outlets, paper, TV news channels, YouTube channels. This is a little recent one. And what I have witnessed, and I think we all have seen, that it comes in a very crude form, is reflected globally in a very crude form. When there is a reporting on the conflict during a war, either it's time of Afghanistan or Iraq, there's a long list. When you see that the kind of news which are coming, Just now when I'm talking to you, the kind of news which were coming from my neighbor country, Sri Lanka, who are reporting, the reports are coming from which background, basically what are the political interests of the person, of the media houses. That has become very crude and naked. I have covered climate change for a little long. And during that time also I have witnessed very closely that how the whole discussion, how the whole narration, even for the journalist like me, who is coming from a third world country, the whole discussion was favoring the countries which were rich, the whole kind of press releases, the information. So definitely, the most important question is that what divides news from propaganda? And I just want to focus on India, and especially on the North India, the Hindi belt or the cow belt. And when I want to discuss about this, what I feel that when I say that it has been a different kind of time for us from last 2 decades, which I'm witnessing, because all of us know that how the things have grown from a very majoritarian government, from the government, not only the government, but the different institutes on which the democracy rely. So they have almost in a shattered form there as a journalist, I feel. And in that, I just want to make reference to 2-3 incidents, the recent incidents from where I just want to build my logic. I'm based in Delhi, national capital, and I have seen very closely, inch by inch, how Delhi, because at that time I was trying to get many informations from the ground. I was covering citizenship amendment, whole movement against the citizenship movement, which was anti-CA protest, which was happening. And at the same time, I have witnessed that how the capital was burned, how the Delhi program happened. So in many places, I was there, I was an eyewitness how the things happened, how it was reported, how the whole climax was built. One thing is that. And second, little back, just next to Delhi is Muzaffarnagar. And Muzaffarnagar, there was a huge, I don't want to say it was a riot, because riot where the 2 communities clash, it was not a riot. Even the Muzaffarnagar in 2013, I was eyewitness to the way things has happened there, how the killings happened, how the gang rapes has taken place. I myself was stuck in that conflict zone at that time. And to little of that, 2 things if I add to. And third thing, which was very important and close to my heart, and it has disturbed me as a reporter, as an Indian citizen, reporting during the Corona time. When the Corona was on the height and it was killing people, the way the reporting, the way whole narration was built up against Muslims. Even the governments were forced to declare that how many Corona patients are connected with the Tablighi or not Tablighi, daily briefings. So that shows that basically continuously the media has been turned into, and when I talk about the media, I talk about the corporate media, the mainstream media. And it's very important to recognize that who is owning the media houses. And I think in India, it's a very unique case here that the ownership is in just few hands. We know who are they. We know Ambani, how many media outlets he holds, how much investment, huge investment in takeovers in media has happened, and it has gone all unregistered. So 2 things happened at that time, that the media ownership is in few hands, very limited hands, and a huge corporate ownership is there in India, which is practicing. So if I or you want to report as a journalist, we want to report on the issues which the corporate is not ready to. Right now, if I want to report on anything on economic offense, huge economic offenses, scams are taking place. But you will not find any kind of investigative journalism which was happening when I joined journalism. It has been killed because nobody is there to fund you for the investigative journalists, to bring out the scams, and if you are bringing out, then definitely we have seen how it has happened yesterday in National Capital. Ravi Nair, how he was summoned and how he was, and everyone basically who want to report on the things which are, this kind of surveillance, we have seen the Pegasus when it came, how Indian journalists, and not only the journalists who are in the capital or in the metros, the journalists who are in remote areas, the tribal areas, they were kept under the surveillance. So that shows basically that how this nexus, that they want to create a different kind of information flow, that this is the truth. When we talk about the post-truth is that I have to be careful when I'm going to report. Right now, there is a Kamadiyas, they are going across. The Savan is there and Kamadiyas, I have to face them daily. But if I want to report that what kind of malpractices are happening there, how the youth are being taken into their folds, and how the whole flow of drugs, drinks, and everything is happening, nobody is there. I will be declared immediately anti-national, anti-Hindu. So basically, this perception building media, when it has become a perception building industry, and the perception is decided through the whole post-truth, that the sentiments, you see, when we are talking, we know that the topmost fact checker, the journalist Zubair, who is connected with Alt News, who has been doing a tremendous work through all his colleagues in Alt News, he has to spend 23 to 24 days in jail just because 2 or 3 tweets. And all the tweets he was talking that this is wrong, which you have been tweeting, and it is not correct. Simple tweets. And here I want to put on record that the same Zubair, his tweets during Corona times, even Uttar Pradesh police, even Maharashtra police was retweeting, and they were saying that, okay, please don't spread so much hatred. So this is what is the post-truth era in India right now. That if I have to write something, if I have to do a story on something, then I have to be very careful that whose sentiment is going to get disturbed. And we know whose sentiment, because it's majority, the Hindu majority sentiment have become a governing factor for all the different pillars of democracy. So that's the biggest irony right now, because all the hate mongers, because generally people will talk what is truth. I'm saying for me as a journalist, what is happening in front of me. I was very young when I have seen the demolition of Babri Masjid. I was a student of class 8 when I went along with my father because he was covering that event. But right now, if I have to talk and I have to write in a Hindi vernacular language, that it was demolished by these fellows, then there can be a huge uproar. The Hindu sentiment can, at that time, it was able to write. Many journalists, all journalists have written at that time. But right now, how the scene has changed, how this truth, that Babri Masjid was demolished by a group of people who, in which there was Adani, there was Atal, everything is there on record, but nobody was proven guilty. And now you can't question the whole structure because it is in favor of the majoritarianism. So what I feel that right now when we are discussing the whole notion that how we are going to report, and there are so many things to report. Suppose I'm talking, just now I did a story, I do video shows for NewsClick. I was just discussing to how we are going to see our new president, Draupadi Murmu, who is first time, anyhow, everybody has to hail that first time, a Adivasi woman, a Santhal woman, first time a woman who is, or president who is born after independence is on the this ladder. Definitely it has to be hailed. But at the same time, if I want to bring that how she is looking to the Adivasi issue, how she is connected with the Brahma Kumari sect, which has nothing to do with the Adivasi culture, and they have to deal their basic agenda is to preach that you have to become vegetarianism, you have to leave the liquor, and then you have to become a pure soul. So as a journalist, I should report on this. This is in public domain. But before writing, and how many people are writing about it? So these are very small things which, as a journalist, this is not an investigative journalist. This is a simple reporting on the events which are happening in front of us, and how it is very difficult to report on the conflict which is happening, because so much pressure on the journalist at the ground that you are questioning the people who are in the power. So this is the biggest irony right now. And what I feel, the ray of the hope, or some whatever you can say, that from where I can breathe, or I get the energy, or all of us get the energy, that so much pressure is there, so much onslaught is there. There is very less hope to get a legal remedy also. When I'm talking to you, I should remember Sadiq Kappan, who's a journalist from Kerala. And almost at the same time we were traveling, I was also traveling to Hathras. And he was,
Bhasha, sorry, I think your 10 minutes are...
okay, just in a minute, I will just...
You can wrap up, thanks.
So I just want to say that Sadiq Kappan is still in jail. He has not written a single word on Hathras incident. A Hathras where a Dalit woman was brutally gang raped, and finally she lost her life. So this is the reality, that he is a part of some international conspiracy which was happening around and there's no justice to him. So when, as a journalist, I talk, I definitely remember 21 journalists who were in jail or who were detained last year, 14 and 15 journalists who are still in jail this year. So basically what I want to put, that there is a huge threat on reporting, not the truth, I'm saying quote unquote, but the incident which we are watching, witnessing. And the ray of hope is my last word, that still I found hundreds of journalists, youngsters who are doing on the YouTube or on different channels, they are ready to report, work without much economic support or much economic. So this is also a good thing which I find, that the spirit is there, the fighting spirit is there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhasha. You can feel the passion in your voice and in your description of all these events. We will definitely come back to them for questions and during the discussion. Our next speaker is Lawrence Liang, Professor of Law at Ambedkar University. As a legal scholar, he's written on free speech, media regulation, and the lack of it, and brings to the table some very interesting paradoxes. The whole notion of free speech was championed by American liberalism, as we've also heard from Arvind, in the interests of autonomy, individuality, and democracy as a sort of free market of ideas. But what happens when free speech, as Bhasha has so eloquently put it, advocates violence, irrationality, ideological hatreds, and fake news that tramples on the old understanding of quote unquote decent debate and discussion? Is free speech ever really free? Lawrence, please take over.
Thanks, Alpana. So as you rightly mentioned, there is a kind of a paradoxical situation that we find ourselves in, where there seems to be a recognition on the one hand of the law doing too little, and at the same time of the law doing too much. So if you have, for example, the inability of the law to respond to the crisis of the post-truth scenario, you also simultaneously have the law acting in ways that it's very familiar with, which is overreach in terms of, for example, the Mohammed Zubair case, etc. So I'm going to be looking at this paradox of the relationship between free speech and the regulation of media in a post-truth world. And I want to begin with kind of a very unlikely image of a free speech hero that we saw in November 2020. And here I'm referring to Arnab Goswami, the poster boy in many ways of what is entirely wrong with the media. After his arrest by the police, Bombay police in November 2020, when he spent a couple of days in jail, when he was released, there was a motorcade that took place with Arnab Goswami being kind of, paraded as the greatest martyr of media and as this kind of icon of free speech. This left a lot of traditional defenders of free speech a little flummoxed, and we had to ask ourselves what exactly it is that we're defending. One of the great cliches of free speech comes to us from Voltaire, who argued that even if I disagree strongly with you, I will fight till I die to defend your right to say, what you want to say. And my presentation is basically going to unpack this paradox that we find ourselves in. There are several normative pillars that justifies freedom of speech and expression, and concomitantly gives a privileged position to the media. And these include, for example, the democracy function. Media is a watchdog of democracy. The argument of autonomy, or the argument of the self, that the free expression is the best guarantor, in a way, for the exercise of one's autonomous identity. And finally, there is the argument of truth, that it's only free media that can promote the pursuit of truth. And I want to try to look at this idea of what the pursuit of truth and its relation to media has been. All of us have already identified the great crisis that fake news, disinformation, misinformation places on the question of truth. But what does it mean to think about our relationship between media, law, and regulation? We are at a paradoxical juncture where, on the one hand, we're witnessing a rise in instances of censorship, both by state as well as non-state actors. And there is a need, an urgent need, to reiterate our fundamental commitment to free speech. But at the same time, you're witnessing the debilitating effects that fake news has on political and ethical life. And the impact of this is echoed in calls for greater regulation of media. So how do you balance between these paradoxical impulses? And is there a need for a fundamental rethink of the premises of liberalism as the bedrock upon which a philosophy of free speech can be grounded? I'm going to address this by addressing three thematics. Let me look at the first one. What is the impact of post-truth on law? If you look at a speech made by the Chief Justice of India, Chief Justice Ramana, a couple of days ago, he describes the crisis rather well when he talks about the dangers of trial by media, describing the media as running kangaroo courts, and particularly harsh on electronic media, where he says, unlike print media, it has zero accountability. And by overstepping and breaching their responsibility, he says, you're taking our democracy 2 steps backward, right? From Sushant Singh Rajput suicide to the recent arrest of Zubair, the idea of an ordeal of trial by media is something that's become common currency. And it's interesting that the word ordeal is used, because the word ordeal actually has juridical roots, referring as it does to ancient and medieval legal practices, where the guilt or the innocence of a person was established by subjecting the person to extremely violent and painful experiences, walking on hot coal, dipping your hands in hot oil, etc. If you emerged unscathed, which was humanly impossible, your innocence was established, while any wound or injury that you suffered was a self-evident sign of your guilt. Now, these ancient trials by ordeal had very little to do with the establishment of legal truth, and they were primarily concerned with being able to deliver judgments that were satisfying for their swift justice and the vindication of popular sentiment. So the putative value of truth in these cases therefore existed only as a self-confirmation of existing beliefs and prejudices. Now, it's important to remember that the entire emergence of the modern legal system in many ways was tied to the establishment of protocols to determine legal truth. Now, there's nothing new about media trials. So what distinguishes our present moment from earlier instances? To my mind, there are a few factors which come together. First, a transformed media ecology. Traditionally, if you look at the concerns of the right to fair trial, they were articulated around a triadic structure involving very distinct actors, such as the media on the one hand, legal institutions on the other, including both police and courts, and the public. Now, to take Kittler's phrase, the media situation in our times is significantly different, where the worlds of print, broadcast, and social media fuse into each other, and media is no longer a distinct institution, but rather a mode of being, with every person simultaneously a producer, transmitter, and consumer of media at the same time. The blurring of media also extends to a blurring of institutional roles and norms. So, for example, you have the police who maintain Twitter handles, who regularly produce media, and act as the primary content provider for media channels, even as they respond and act upon media reports? Where does the role of an investigating agency end and that of a media producer begin? How does one distinguish between what William Mazzarella describes as the overlap between public interest and the interest of publicity? The second factor, of course, is exactly the affectively charged domain of post-truth and fake news, where narratives that rely on their affective charge become more relevant than the objective truth that underlies or presumes investigative procedures. And there are good reasons why the notion of a legal truth is a highly proceduralized one and subject, at least in theory, to high standards of validation and dispute. Truth validating processes, which are instituted in codes of criminal procedure and evidence, are often the dull, boring, and necessary world of forensic rigor. When the role of policing intertwines with the role of media circulation, you have a scenario in which the actual functioning of criminal investigation is anticipated and usurped by criminal imaginaries, and truth validating procedures gives way to speculative fiction. Were this only a matter of a local dispute between bad detective fiction and principled criminal investigation, one could, for the sake of entertainment, accede to the jurisdiction of crime fiction. But legal truth has extremely serious and severe consequences. And adherence to procedure is not merely a matter of form, but constitutes the very substance of a fair criminal justice system. So this is where our paradox now lies. We are aware of what the problem is. The question is, what can we do about it? Normally, the demand, whenever there is a crisis of this kind, is for greater legal regulation. The problem, however, is the fact that you have a scenario in India, unlike in the US, where if in the US there is an absolutism of free speech as an absolute right, in the Indian context, what we really have is a blurring of the distinction between the idea of media regulation and censorship. There has been a weaponization of media laws to an extent that it is impossible to think about media regulation without collapsing it within the idea of censorship. So what do we do about this, right? The presumption of regulation is that regulation works when there is an objective principle rather than when it is weaponized. And this double-edged sword of having a situation in which anytime you think about the possibilities of reining in media, well knowing the fact that the same law is going to be used not against the large corporate media that Bhasha talked about, but against individual practitioners, is the precise crisis that we find ourselves in. The paradox can be best illustrated in a way by a very well-known joke from Ajit, the Hindi movie Villain, where Ajit would be found ordering Robert, his henchman, to put the protagonist into liquid oxygen. And he says, liquid usko jeene nahi dega, oxygen usko marne nahi dega. If one were to imagine truth as a protagonist placed in similar situations, the problem with the post-truth world is that on the one hand, fake news will not allow any idea of reasoned debate to exist, even as the rhetoric of free speech will not allow it to die. So the question then is, where do we turn to and how do we make sense of this kind of free speech machismo that encourages us to listen to things which are bad for for collective life, which are bad for ethics, on the presumption that somehow a little kind of injection of this poison is necessary to maintain a larger healthy public sphere. There's much more that I can say about this, but because I've run out of time, perhaps I'll bring back some of these aspects of the discussion into the Q&A section. But to leave you then with this question of, is there a possibility of imagining a return to an idea of regulation by a return to an idea of truth? Is there any value that the return to truth has for reimagining the possibility of some mode of regulation that's not necessarily censorship? I'll stop here for now and perhaps take some of these again. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence, for all those tremendous insights. And I think we can, we have a sort of wealth of information now in which to start our discussion with all three of you. So let me first start with, I'm going to start with a bit of a slightly provocative question, given that the panel and the audience that we have Well, maybe they think this is a provocative question. We call this era post-truth era, but as all of you have said, is there any such thing as an absolute truth? I mean, there have always been corporate biases. That's not new. State biases, party biases, and the powerful weightage of liberal tradition, which is a bias in itself. So traditional or conservative opinion did not have the kind of space that liberal opinion did for many, many, many years. And this was a liberal consensus. It was not just set by the United States, but also by India in 1947 as a liberal democracy. That's what we defined ourselves as a secular state, as a state of equals. What's the great difference between that era of a more genteel, hidden bias, but still institutional, and this one, which is a strident, overt, and completely unapologetic one? I mean, nobody's scared to show their biases. Why is this worse? I think, Lawrence, you touched upon that. So let me give you the first chance to answer that. And I'm going to distribute the questions, so not everybody will answer each question, but feel free to intervene if you have an important point or, whatever.
Thanks, Alpana. So, I mean, everyone has kind of agreed on the fact that we're not talking about an absolute conception of truth. And perhaps an absolute conception of truth is not even a desirable one. But I think it's useful to distinguish between two elements of the idea of truth here. If one were to think, for example, of an idea of truth in terms of as being a relationship of correspondence, which is that there is X corresponding to Y in absolute certainty, that's an absolute idea of truth, right? And an absolute idea of truth has never existed. And part of the problem that many people identify with the post-truth era is that, in the aftermath of postmodernism, when everyone declared the death of grand narratives, the death of absolute truths, etc., it was impossible to hold on to a singular conception of truth. And I don't think that's the conception of truth that we're even arguing about. In contrast to, let's say, the argument of truth as correspondence, if one had to think, for example, of the idea of truth as coherence, what it alerts you to is not necessarily the idea of an absoluteness of truth, but on protocols, on mechanisms, and on procedures by which one could have competing claims to truth, asserting the truthfulness of their claims. And in that way, I mean, in many senses, if one were to think about the idea of ethical journalism, if you think about the idea of fact-checking, etc., there is no guarantee that the fact-checker is the absolute guarantor of truth. But the fact-checker is at least giving you a coherent theory of what their claims arise from. And what is interesting in some ways is...
Yeah. So let me just interrupt you there. So if the fact-checker himself in this vast ocean of information, and where anyone can say anything and opinions are, in their millions, if we can't check his bias, what are we looking for for truth when we as consumers of information, maybe Bhasha can weigh in on this one, are we looking for some sort of, Lawrence talked about evidence. Do you think that evidence-based facts would be truth that everybody can adhere to? I mean, we find in the post-truth era that even that is not enough. I just did a series of stories on the Central Vista, and I wrote the truth that it's completely illegal. But nobody believes that. If you talk to anybody, they don't want to read the facts. They don't want to read the legalities. They just think, oh, it's great progress. So, Bhasha, would you weigh in on that? That why do you think that evidence-based truths as well are not necessarily believed either? I mean, I think Arvind also spoke about how people are accepting stories that are questionable. So again, what is the difference between the earlier age and just now? Could you, do you have an understanding?
That's very important, and I think that's a very hard-burning question you have posed to everyone. I was just thinking while listening to you and Lawrence also, that what was the difference between Obama, Trump, and now Joe Biden? So whether there was some Congress, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Congress, and now Narendra Modi. So that's the importance. That's the difference of the degree. And at the same time, what I feel that we should recognize that what is a democracy and what is a civil society. In a civil society, I, you, or no one can accept that some person should justify lynching. No person should justify that a person should do manual scavenging or die under sewer and septic tank by cleaning. That should be the state risk. Some norms, some liberty as a
some
woman,
basic decency,
some basic
or some,
decency, and some basic decency, and some you can say this level that the government should not go down to this. What do we say, that the below the belt, how you are going to mark in it. There have been incidents we have seen during, that's why I mentioned during the wars, the Afghanistan and the Iraq war told that how much lie a Western world can pose on these nations. But at the same time, you will find, but I feel your question lies in that, but the information, you have an information, I have an information, and I have collected the information from the ground the way you have collected on the Central Vista. But if they, in the post era, you feel that there is a king and the king should build a palace under his name, the logo should be there. It should not be the Ashok Istam, it should be the roaring lions. So that's the difference, because then the basic thrust from the democracy that all are equal. But for I just trust my constitution so far. Indian constitution gives me the right that I should talk to you. If this constitution is taken away, then whether we can have this kind of a meeting virtually also, that also will be under question. So basically, the basic thing we have to look that what for a democracy, but for a civilized country, civilized nation, civilized civilians, I should have this much of trust that, okay, if I'm driving my car, if I'm riding on the road, no Kavadia just can come and barge on me and just tell that, okay, you are a Hindu or not, why you are taking my photo. This is not what in Indian constitution he is supposed to do. I have a legal rights. So I think here I want to draw a line that yes, earlier times were bad, but we traveled with such a difficulty. And as a woman, I feel it very earnestly that we have traveled with such a difficulty and reached to this level where I can have a right over my dignity, my privacy, right over my body, how many children I can produce. No Baba, no saint can come. No, I'm a Hindu, I have to produce only son. But right now, I'm facing this thing in front of me. They are going, I'm going to cover this Burari and everywhere. And they are asking that what kind of a Hindu you are, how many sons you have given birth to. So this is what I'm saying. It comes like an electric shock to me.
Right.
So this is where we have to draw the line, I think.
Okay. So there is a notion of something going below a standard or a level that is unacceptable. That is the notion that you're talking about, Bhasha. Arvind, how do these things become acceptable? I think you touched upon that, and I think your notion of mystic democracy, which seems to be people power, but is an active collaboration of enabling media, trolls, state, and so all these agencies. How does that make the unacceptable line acceptable? Or how does it blur this line so that things that were unacceptable just a few years ago are now not just acceptable, but they are celebrated? So how does this happen? I mean, if you could just talk about the process of how this happens, you know.
Yeah, I thank you, Alpana, and thank you, Bhasha and Lawrence, for your very illuminating remarks. I mentioned this idea of a system of communication, which can be said to have a bias or a setting. Yeah, so I think this idea of a setting is very useful. And it becomes clear when we compare previous periods, the shock at the violence around Babri Masjid back in 92 versus the acceptance of a much higher level of violence today. So that suggests something that refers to, the sort of overall controls of a communication system. There's something else that we can think about, which is that indeed today we have multiple viewpoints, there's a proliferation of news perspectives. And the question for the individual citizen or consumer is, how do I decide when somebody is saying, that Muslims are bad and somebody else is saying Muslims are good, somebody else is saying Hindus are, should be in a majority and have to exercise their dominance, someone else is saying something else. How do I decide, right? And the question of responding to a media context where conflicting information arrives, we find that the way in which people tend to respond and manage this kind of conflict of perspectives is not by trying to find out what the actual truth is. Rather, they tend to go with what feels right to them. So it's a kind of ethical response according to what they understand. Yeah. So what we have here, therefore, is the multiple perspectives and multiple viewpoints in the news media, and the difficulty of arriving at a definite truth leads people perhaps to revert back to their primal identity, their sort of primal cultural basis, and make decisions and devise their sort of ethical norms on the basis of that. Yeah, so
it's somewhat like a return to the womb. Is that what you're saying?
Somewhat, yes, or yes, a certain kind of regression. Yeah, when you said the clock is ticking backwards,
right,
there's something like that going on. Yeah, so certainly we can say the Nehruvian period was an attempt to change the value system. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that it's very difficult to say that we're going to change your value system. Instead, we had a language of modernization and development. Today, all of those things are assumed as fait accompli, but we find this reversion to a kind of autarkic cultural identity, which makes the whole problem of democracy very different from what it used to be. Yeah.
Okay, Lawrence, let me ask you this, because you did talk about how do we balance. I think everybody on the panel has sort of thrown up their hands and said, this is out of control. And so everybody recognizes it's out of control. Nobody knows what to do about it. And you have explained the difficulty of regulation, especially in the Indian context, where regulation, as Bhasha so eloquently described all her, or I should say our fellow journalists who are imprisoned for nothing at all. I mean, a tweet in 2018, or not writing about Hathras, or just absolutely nothing at all. And this is the kind of a state behavior that I have seen in my reporting years in Kashmir in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And I'm sure in the Northeast and other areas where there have been conflict, where questions are not asked, where there is people just have to be locked up to show they have been locked up. And I think the sort of impact, the visual and the emotive impact of people being locked up is very important in this era for the state. What I would ask you is that you've talked about how to balance regulation and how do we balance regulation and censorship. If there is a popular consensus to many of the things that the state is doing in the name of this cultural identity, or in the post-truth era, or creating or shaping a new identity, moving away from the old Nehruvian imagery. How does that work? How do we sort of how do we balance the censorship or the regulation if the popular consensus says that yes, there should be censorship, or yes, so and so should be thrown into jail, or no, that's not unjust, that's completely just, let's throw him into jail. So there's a sort of popular baying for a victim, I mean, not a victim, sorry, a sacrifice, or some sort of some sort of I don't know how to describe it, for events that have happened, something that puts it to rest, and so a journalist has been put into jail and the problem is over. Can you comment on that?
Very difficult one in terms of what can be done, but I think conceptually, at least one can imagine that one needs to move away from a very kind of a impoverished conception of democracy as being reducible to a play of numbers, and consequently, therefore, to a play of majority sentiment. And on that count, I think it's the role of the judiciary, which has been a very important one. Because in many ways, of course, the legislature and the executive will pander to the rule of the majority. Historically, the role of the judiciary has been that of a counter-majoritarian institution, where it relies not so much on a majoritarian conception of democracy as much as a constitutional conception of democracy. Now, I'm not going into the question of the extent to which the judiciary has succeeded or failed us in the contemporary moment. And I think it's important, therefore, to keep an eye on history, to argue that historically, it has been a fact that whenever there is an overstepping and a breach in a way of the separation of powers, one needs to bring back the idea of the role of the judiciary as a counter-majoritarian institution. And in the order on Zubair, I think that the court is doing that. The court, by alerting us to the idea that arrest cannot be punitive, that the procedure cannot be the punishment, etc., it is pleading for us to actually look at what needs to be done, because in many ways, another paradox that we have is that none of these cases that are actually filed, whether of sedition or of hate speech, etc., will actually hold in a court of law. But the point is, it doesn't matter. The point is that you've already arrested the person, you subjected them to the medieval ordeal in a modern process, right? And there is a fundamental paradox here where the letter of the law as it exists, for example, in section 124A, 153A, etc., are prone to abuse in such a systematic way that there is a need for the judiciary to step in and now actually lay down what the parameters of interpretation and action should be as far as the police is concerned. So I would say that, yeah, the combination of this counter-majoritarian role, along with its historical kind of function as a preserver of rights, precisely at a point when everything is threatened.
Yes, I completely agree with you there, but I would argue just that institutions are the first thing, and as Bhasha has talked about as well, to be eroded, to be demolished, to be debilitated. And that's very true, equally true of the United States, where the Supreme Court's recent abortion ruling is an example of how an institution has been packed with certain people to behave in a certain way and to respond in a certain way for many years to come. I mean, because the system in the US is such that the justices of the Supreme Court serve, literally forever. If you pack them with enough of a particular ideology, you'll be getting the results that you want, that a particular regime wants, And it's the same in India. I'm not talking about just the judiciary, but plenty of institutions across. All the notion of independent institutions itself has been gutted. Whether it's got to do with urban planning, whether it's got to do with policing, whether it's got to, any kind of institution, even the municipal corporation has been, the notion of people power, has been comprehensively gutted at this point in time. So we don't have the institutions, we have popular consensus, and it looks pretty hopeless. Arvind, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, well, just one thing, maybe looking for rays of hope, so to say, that, we have a government that has very comprehensively rejected the Congress legacy, has called for a Congress Mukt Bharat, and denounces, what Nehru has done to the country and regards true independence as having arrived with the current ruling party. But that's in domestic politics. And when you look at international affairs, there is a constant reassertion of precisely a Nehruvian image for the country, that we are secular, we are tolerant.
And why do you find that so? Is that because that sells? It's just a notion that sells, or why do you find that so?
Well, they cannot say, yes, we believe in Hindu majority. They cannot say, yes, we believe in democracy for some folks and not for others. That is simply not acceptable. So to that extent, the formal world order is a liberal world order. And
Still.
Even today, that's right. That's the formal world order. Yeah, so that appears to be a sort of court of appeal, which is why Zubair went to jail. It was not because, Indians were paying attention. It was because the Middle East was paying attention that Zubair went to jail. So that's what we have to pay attention to.
Okay. Bhasha? Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to add 2-3 things to it, because when we are discussing, and Lawrence right now rightly put the things, that the judiciary or the institutions, when it comes to Kashmir, when it comes to Northeast, when it comes to Muslims, especially North Kashmir right now, because we have just seen Sana Matto being denied to go, a Pulitzer Award winning journalist, how she has been denied with her basic right to go and attend the exhibition in the France, or the Manipur thing, or the Naga killing, in which the High Court came out and then the Supreme Court said that it will have a demoralizing effect on the army. So what I feel that this biasness against few sections, those sections are very big, pretty big. When we talk about the reservation, that's a pretty big sections which we are talking about. So this notion is coming from a political impunity. Basically, the political masters, the way it has been clubbed now, that all institutions are marching along the line what the political masters want. And especially after the Justice Loya case and his death, the kind of pressure under which judiciary is passing through, because this judiciary has passed through the Ram Mandir verdict. So what I feel that this whole notion that they have to follow the political masters and the democracy is being molded into new form. That's a new India. In this new India, the Hindus have right, and that too Hindus who are along with that kind of a majoritarianism, that lynching, that hatredness. So here, basically a political challenge, unless and until is emerged. And some islands like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, some few states are still a little ahead, which are putting a different kind of a challenge and notion. But you find that all these structures which we are talking about are more or less, sometimes they will give some judgment on the Zubair, but at the same time you see that 2 days or a day before they have to say on the Nupur Sharma, nobody asked them to arrest or have a case against him. So this kind of a balancing act also is happening. And basically all are playing through the political tunes. And one last thing which Alpana I want to just mention on record, that we have seen that how media, their anchors, their heads, how they have been tweeting the tweets which have been coming from the political masters, same cut and paste. So you see the pressure, the control, because it's a controlled democracy. What we feel that it is basically not democracy in the real sense. That's why the challenge has to come from the political ground. Whenever it has come, be it a farmer protest, I want to mention here, when the farmer protest was here more than a year, you see the whole narration and you see the sound across. International sounds were happening. They were coming in the Time magazine. Shaheen Bagh, Bilkis Bano was coming in the Time magazine. So there is a huge unrest at the ground, which is not getting reflected in the political language. Once it happens, then there are little frictions. Otherwise, the whole regime is moving toward Hindu majoritarian, fascist nature of a state, where the democracy, there is a bell which you say, okay, there is a democracy, as Arvind rightly said, that they need to have one face as an international level. You have to talk about democracy. You have to talk there to the media, because we are living in the country where last 7-8 years, there is not a single press conference by the Prime Minister. Nobody is questioning about it. So this is a very different kind of era, because he is talking about a different Kalkhand, a new India. In this new India, the new parliament, which you have been reported, which we all know, there is no media room. There is no space for media. So that's the truth where we are lying right now. And I feel that there, unless and until there is an upsurge and there are unrest, I don't want to disregard the unrest or the protest, be it the young students who are marching 1,668 kilometers from Nagpur to Delhi, or the different kind of thing. The only thing is that how the political it is going to channelize, because Otherwise, the march is on one tune. Thanks.
Okay. Lawrence, let's come back to your idea of how do we balance this? Because if it's so much out of control, and we've actually, though both Bhasha and Arvind have given us examples of hope and ideas of how there can be an imagined future that comes back to that basic level that Bhasha talked about of civility or civilization or standards. The fact is that it has to be dealt with today in an era where, of course, we talk about institutions being eroded, we talked about popular consensus, but also a sort of time when elections are managed so brilliantly that the hope of these movements, however big they are or however strong they are, as we've seen, they peter out, or they come to some sort of settlement. And in Punjab we saw that there was some sort of a settlement that favored what the farmers wanted, or whether it's CAA, so all these movements on the ground that give hope, that hope seems to be dashed at the elections, no matter what. So what is it that can change this narrative? I'm not talking about regulation. I'm not talking about censorship. I'm just talking about existing in this sort of toxic ocean and finding a way to clean it bit by bit, or to make inroads into something that actually grows, incrementally perhaps, but makes a difference at some point.
There's an American anthropologist called Michael Taussig who says of hope, and he asks, when do you need hope? So not when you have any. You need it precisely at the moment when there is only evidence to the contrary, right? And so if one had to think about the idea of, this affective or a sentiment that one is looking for in the contemporary, let me turn to a story about a lawyer who practiced during, the Third Reich. This is a Jewish lawyer called Ernst Frankl, who was actually a civil liberties lawyer defending, can you imagine, communists, liberals, at the time while the Nazi regime was taking place, under the most difficult situations and circumstances where the rule of law has been completely crushed, not just eroded, but evaporated, right? And he was still practicing. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at Frankel's career, Frankl actually wrote a book called The Dual State, which in a way echoes what Arvind has been talking about. Frankel's conception of the dual state is, he says that the state always exists in a duality between the normative state, which speaks the language of liberalism, liberal values, etc., even as it acts as the prerogative state that uses sheer political power to override the normative state, right? Frankl, I think, in his own work, holds on to these minute threads of possibilities or of the idea of the normative, that the normative remains and retains a symbolic value, becomes a tool for Frankl, right, to actually work against the prerogative state. And I think that a lot of what we are attempting to do in the moment, both as thinkers and practitioners and activists, would be that. How do you retain, in a way, the idea of the normative to work against the prerogative? It's a very leaky umbrella, but it's the only one we have. So we're not going to abandon it.
Right. That's quite sort of inspirational and encouraging, and it's a great note to end on. So I think we have we can open the floor for questions. There's a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to go through them. I don't think they are aimed at. Yeah, some of them are aimed particularly at people. So at the panelists. So then I will do that. But Let me just read out the first question, which is the general one. Is the ideal of truth the core problem? We assume there is such a thing as the public interest, which is a self-evident truth, whereas we have competing private claims to define the public interest. Should our focus on truth shift to an unmasking of the politics over the articulation of what is public? Would anybody like to attempt that? Arvind? Lawrence, were you saying something? Sorry.
Arvind, go ahead. I'll follow you.
Okay. And if we can keep our questions shortish, because we have a bunch of them to go through, it'll be interesting to hear different opinions. Arvind, I think you're muted.
Yeah. So just very briefly, it's very like we're in such an extraordinary time today that we can face something like climate change. We can face something like gun violence. We can face something like the pandemic and still have completely irreconcilable views about what it is and what to do about it. So this is an extraordinary moment. Yeah. And as I've said, this is not only in India, it's also all across the world. And I see it as a kind of backlash of the communication revolution. That communication revolution is turning in on itself. Instead of taking us forward, it's taking us back. And we have to understand that. But I remain optimistic because, as a famous writer has said, humankind sets itself only such problems as it can solve. So the challenge for us is to perceive the problem. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. We're not wringing our hands. We're actively trying to clarify the problem before us. Yeah, I'll just stop there and let Lawrence carry on.
Lawrence?
I want to respond to Prem, and I want to take a slightly contrarian view here. I think that the systematic kind of undermining of the value of truth, whether in academia or in popular public life, has led us to a situation that we find ourselves in. And I think that it's time
let me just ask you this question again. Is it the liberal consensus over the last so many years that has led to this situation?
I mean, I think that would be being a little unfair to the liberal consensus as being the only source of the problem.
Not the only, but one of.
Certainly, we would be disingenuous if we didn't, also acknowledge the complicity of the liberal contribution to the truth problem, right? And I think that it's time in a way to re-articulate the value of truth. Now, of course, what does that actually mean? Does it mean returning to a la-la land of an absoluteness of truth? No, but it does, in a way, demand of us a certain kind of a thick or critical engagement with the idea that, no, there is a value to asserting something called truth. The question is, what are the protocols and procedures that you arrive at that truth with, and how do you defend that? And I think that in that sense, I wouldn't identify truth being the core problem. Truth is the solution to the core problem that we have, which is its diminishing in value. So on that sense, I mean, I disagree with what Prem is saying. Maybe we are actually saying the same things in terms of, the unmasking that Prem talks about might well be about the idea of how do you actually closely look at the protocols of truth. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay. Another question which I think has been answered by both of you. Can the media ever become independent or free again anytime in the future? And if yes, how? I think we've discussed that a lot in our in the discussion. I can see high anxiety here, with in this question, which is sort of across all citizens that think in terms of media actually being free and being able to be trusted. The notion of trust comes here again. Bhasha, would you just want to quickly answer that? Can the media ever become independent again? And if yes, how? But a very brief, short answer, because I think we've covered ground here.
I want to say that this whole notion of completely free is a utopian concept, that completely free, but definitely media will reach to the point where it has to be of the media. Media means, because I just want to make one point, that truth, people know what truth is, and that's why the main issues or the core issues in the deep countries where the capitalism has succeeded are again coming back: economy, social security. So I think there lies the truth that media definitely with the fight, as I just want to quote Romila Thapa, she gave, I have taken her interview. In that last line, she said that Nazis also went off. Nobody is going to rule. It all depends that how we are going to play our role, because every era has to come to an end. But basically, it depends that how the citizens of that country are going to regain or reclaim the democracy and the country. So here I feel that media definitely, and it is coming back. People are reporting, even in the Kashmir, young journalists, the way they are reporting, even in the Northeast, journalists are reporting. That gives a lot of hope that we want a different kind of a media.
Okay. If the opinion worldview comes first and facts are used to justify them, or can't be used to change them, is the search for truth the fundamental solution? After all, there is a long history of science being used as a tool of suppression. Is societal embracing of empathy or critical thinking a better line of pursuit? Arvind, you want to answer that?
Yeah, yes, you're quite right that science has been used for the convenience of political power. And what we have today is very much, I think, Mads, you're right, it's a kind of questioning of science. Now, let's note that the practice of questioning science as a mode of propaganda or counter-propaganda has a very specific history. It arose with the tobacco industry questioning medical sciences, abundant research showing that tobacco caused cancer, right? And it is from the tobacco industry that we had this gem-like statement for our purposes, I'm speaking critically, doubt is our product, right? So the PR industry presented this mode of reacting where doubt was the product that they would create. Yes, there is science, but we have doubt. And today you can find children saying, yes, there may be global warming, but I have doubt. Let's see what the science is. So this practice of questioning the science has carried over from tobacco to climate science to the pandemic. We see it actually, spreading virally. And so I don't think we reject the idea that there can be science and exact truth. I mean, yes, there are going to be debates.
Would you include, Arvind, vaccine skepticism in that?
Very much.
So you would then weigh in on the side of vaccines and
very
not
much. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just come in on this?
Yeah, sure. Of course, Lawrence. Yeah.
So I think, the playoff here is between an idea of an appeal to reason / science as kind of, one of the legacies of modernity with all of its problems versus the appeal to emotion and affect. Now, what Madhav has talked about here are the positive emotions of empathy. But in an era where you're overrun by the negative affects of disgust, of hatred, etc., I will take my chances with reason rather than with emotion. And I'll take my chances with science rather than with its negation, because at least science is subject to what Karl Popper defines as its, defining property, which is a falsification hypothesis. It's not science unless it can be falsified. The problem with self-apparent truths of emotion is that they don't need to be falsified because they are always true.
Right. And just one thing I just want in Indian reference right now, I think the erosion of the scientific temperament or the whole discussion from the public review, from the political masters is so dangerous that we need to develop and establish that there is a science which is fighting not only diseases, but the scientific temperament, which is fighting against all the kind of superstitions which are now imposed as a new science. Because in India, now the whole term of the science is such a thing that plastic surgery was at the time of Ganesha, blah, blah, blah. So it's very important to reinstate the need of science and scientific temperament. That I think that is one of the most urgent thing to take place.
Okay, thanks, Bhasha. Naomi Klein in Shock Doctrine says that they want to keep people in a constant state of shock while making the changes they want. How to combat that? Anyone wants to take that up? Constant state of shock. I think actually it's a sort of a willing shock. I mean, the shock has been around for a long time now. It's been many years, and people have sort of developed a sort of an enjoyment of the shock, or a comfort level with the shock. Anyone want to have a stab at that?
Well, I would add to that argument about disaster capitalism, that it has become a way for the system to thrive, for certain business interests to capitalize on the misery of others, while apparently bewailing the destruction that millions of people are suffering. So we have that kind of disaster capitalism, which is, we've seen during the pandemic, how the billionaires made most money, whereas large numbers of people really were wiped out. Sections of the middle class were wiped out in many societies. So yes, that is what we're seeing. And how to combat that? Well, awareness is the first issue. Maybe one way to do it is also to unplug from the media system. But of course, that carries other dangers immediately with it. So I don't think unplugging can be presented as a comprehensive solution. We have to acknowledge the problem that we are facing here. And yes, there's, understanding its dimensions would be the first step. And hand it over to my co-panelists for further ideas.
Okay. The US is as polarized as India, and the Trump influence on the media was as controlling as in today's India. Equally, corporate ownership is not unique here. A Bezos-owned WAPO appears to be able to put out reliable news. Why can't some individual newspaper or news channel choose to put out reliable news as their business model, and couldn't this be successful, etc.? I think there are models of this, definitely. Bhasha, would you like to talk about that?
Yes.
About media that is actually trying to do exactly this.
Yeah. So I think that that's a big question for everywhere, and many groups, definitely not with so much of funding, but they are sustaining. So far, they are able to sustain in spite of ED raids, in spite of FIRs, and in spite of income tax things. They are able to maintain because there is huge demand. And here, just I want to put one more thing, which I have witnessed when the farmer movement was there. So there was demand for the news for the farmers. So at the same time, a trolley times emerges out of nowhere. It was not a planned thing. It was not a part of movement, nothing. But the youngsters who were coming from a different profession, they joined hand together. They brought trolley times. It reached to multiple languages. So that proves the point that there is a demand. People want to know. But the only thing which differs India, I don't know, I don't want to talk much about the US thing, but in India, the main fund, the kind of investment which is required, the kind of corporate media, the challenge of the TRP, money, advertisement is so much polarized. It's unimaginable. According to P. Sainath, every third journalist is a journalist by Ambani. So that kind of, when polarization is there, the capital hold is there. So it's little difficult, but it's very good. So far, that's why the government is bringing a new act in this monsoon session to regulate all these web portals. But I feel that when there is a demand of truth, of incident, of reporting, people will find the way. That's how the democracy works. So far, it has been working.
Okay. This is a very interesting question. In a post-truth world, how does one counter majoritarian ultra-nationalist narratives? It's interesting, not just because, that's the question of the hour, but is there anything that private citizens can do on their own? So what does the individual do to respond to this huge, massive sort of tsunami of toxic, poison being dumped on him or her? Or is the future bleak, considering that right-wing conservative movements are gaining footholds around the world? Lawrence, you want to answer that? I think that speaks to some of the things that you said in your presentations.
Yeah, so I think, if you try to look at this within a prescriptive framework, or even within a legal prescriptive framework, there's nothing that we can do. It seems too overwhelming. But if one were to take this into the realm of, individual ethics and ask oneself, what is it that I can do? I think that the idea of a return to truth as a particular kind of a value, and here, I think there's something to be said about this. Much before the idea of free speech as some kind of a right existed, it existed as an obligation. So we take the etymological roots of the idea of free speech. Michel Foucault reminds us that the idea of heresia, which is the idea of liberty or speech without, fetters, was actually an obligation, and it was an obligation to truth as much as it was an obligation to oneself. One cultivated oneself as an object in a way of ethical subjectivity, precisely by cultivating, kind of exercises of truth. So what is it that one can do? I mean, best example for me would be in the midst of the heights of, racism and slavery, etc. You had Thoreau, who decided that he wanted to withdraw, right? And he withdrew not by necessarily engaging in some great act of political protest. He eventually became a symbol of that. But he withdrew by retreating into wanting to become a good neighbor. And I think that this domain, in a way, of what we've talked about as the cultivation of decency, which is what we see the absence of in public life, cannot be cultivated in a collective manner. It has to begin in that sense with an articulation of oneself. And I think that this idea of, how does one reimagine the political by withdrawing from it? Arvind has kind of, hinted at this when he says a withdrawal from media. And I think that this politics of withdrawal, not as an apolitical act, but as an act that kind of looks for a re-articulation of what a political vision ought to be, what it means to be able to live as a good neighbor, as a precondition to what it means to articulate the idea of we the people, is something that I think I still hold on to.
So a return to kindness is the simple answer, is what you are saying. And I mean that in an absolutely, absolutely seriously. A return to some sort of decency, a return to kindness, a return to being the good neighbor, and transforming individually the things the way you interact with the world around you.
Decency might well be the most undermined political value of our times, because the traditional fault lines of left versus right don't stand any longer. The currency that the left and the right share are actually the same. The politics of a kind of an outrage that demands, in a way, a certain instantaneous is exactly what has abandoned any idea of decency. And I think that it might well be, therefore, worth it to not see it as a sentimental value, but as a political value.
Right. Another very interesting question. We have just 1 minute left, so I think we should quickly do this. How do we see the use of AI in news visibility, especially the search engines, where certain sources are promoted while others are relegated, in a way that users are fed with certain information while hiding others? In the long run, psychologically leading them to reject any other source. I mean, I think when we talked about elections being winnable, and despite all the movements, all the people power, all the mass mobilization of the public for various reasons, we are looking at organizational muscle, and organizational muscle does come in with AI, with regulation of technology, and the control that Arvind talked about, the temperature setting. You set the control as you want. Arvind, would you like to take that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Alpana. Here, I'm reminded of the US context where, especially during the post-Cold War era, the big tech companies, Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, just became so very large. And you remember their motto was move fast and break things. Okay, and that had a very specific legal implication, which is there was no regulation for the new technology companies. And so they simply went ahead and did whatever they wanted to do. They stole people's intellectual property rights. They claimed rights that they did not have any legal basis for. And today we have a context where Google controls 90% of the search market in the world. And it is because regulators were clueless, technology companies were greedy, the public was uninformed, and there was, behind and above all of this, the sense that we are in an information revolution, which it is wrong or unethical to interrupt or sort of put a spoke in the wheels of that information revolution. And, that information revolution was devised not for people's benefit. It was devised to fight a war against communism. It was popular benefit was a side effect. It was a side effect. Overarching impulses were military and political. So we have to educate ourselves about that and demand regulation where today there's actually very little or inadequate regulation.
Right. I think there's just one last question, and I'll end with Bhasha because this actually has her name in it. Does the future of reliable news lie with our Bhasha languages?
Yeah, definitely. I feel that not only with the vernacular languages, but I do feel that vernacular languages must be promoted because the reach is much more. And you see the way market or the corporate media has moved into it because of the reach. Hindi newspaper, Hindi channels, Telugu channels, Tamil channels. So I think that's a very important thing, that how we are able to reach to the maximum people should be the need of the hour. And secondly, I just want to put one line that there is manufacturing of consent, manufacturing of discontent, dissent. Everything is being manufactured. Right now, we know about the Facebook, we know about the social media, but at the same time, I find one hope, which the citizen was there, that how the Sri Lankans came out to save the country, each and every citizen, because I was reporting thoroughly on that. So what I feel that once I connect that it's my duty to save my country from a fascist onslaught, from an illegal, unethical government, then I will play my role. And definitely the languages, because right now there is a full term in India to make Hindi as a national language. So I think all the regional languages should join hands together and make India as vibrant, as multicultural as it is. That's what we stand for here.
So on that very vibrant and creative note, I think I'm really sorry we've run out of time. And I know there are a few questions that remained unanswered, but thank you to the Bangalore International Center. Thank you to all the panelists. And I think we had a very fruitful, very interesting and exciting discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Alpana.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Bhasha.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.